Hey, everybody. Mark and I have over 20 years of experience as therapists and as addicts in long-term successful recovery. We know better than anyone what works and what doesn't to break out of porn and sex addiction, heal betrayal trauma, and reclaim your relationship.
And we've poured all of our personal and professional recovery and healing experience into a first-of-its-kind program for addicts, spouses, and couples. We call it Dare to Connect.
At least 4 times every week, we engage with you in real time, in the trenches, giving you the knowledge and the tools to take back your life and relationship.
Whatever else you've done on your journey for healing and recovery, you've never done anything like this.
Mark and I, we've made all the mistakes, so you don't have to. Don't reinvent the wheel.
We all know tomorrow never comes. Look, don't wait one more day to change. Claim your free 2-week trial today at daretoconnectnow.com.
Hey, everybody. I'm Steve Moore.
And I'm Mark Castleman.
We know the pain and heartbreak of porn and sex addiction.
And we know the triumph of breaking completely free.
Every day, we help our clients find hope and healing.
Join us in the fight to take back your life, your marriage, and be stronger than ever.
This is the PBSC Squared podcast. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the PBSC podcast. Steve Moore and Mark Castleman here. It's great to be with you guys today. I apologize in advance if my microphone sounds a little bit different. I'm not in my studio. I'm actually on vacation, traveling with family. So if it sounds a little echoey, I apologize. But it's great to be with you guys today. We've got a great topic today for today's episode. I believe, what is this, Mark? Episode 166?
166.
Right? 166. And we're going to talk about, we're going to walk through today a little bit about the process of, or the topic of formal disclosure. We have done 2 other podcasts about different elements of disclosure, specifically kind of covering in general the emotional side of disclosure and what's involved there. But we do get a lot of questions, so we'd invite you to do a search.
We did. In fact, specifically, those are back in February of last year, 2022, February of 2022, we did, as a spouse, you have 4 primary rights with regard to his disclosure. And then back in October of last year, we did an episode on what role can or should a polygraph play in a porn sex addict's disclosure to a partner. Those were the 2 last.
Gotcha. Okay. No, see, Mark's on top of it. I was just going to make you all Google search it. So Mark referenced those, which is great. But yeah, we do get enough questions about, we oftentimes hear, Steve and Mark, what is involved in a disclosure. And so we wanted to just take you through the processes today that are involved in it, with some caveats at the beginning, which is where we'll begin. Mark, you want to take it away on the caveats?
I think we have to talk about how not to do this, just so that everybody knows why there needs to be a very carefully followed set of steps for a formal disclosure, because we have seen so many, untold horror stories with regard to disclosure over the last 20 plus years of our experience with this, plus the way we disclosed or didn't disclose to our own spouses. Yeah. So one of the things you want to be very careful of is you want to make sure that you are not engaging in what we call staggered disclosure. Mm-hmm. And that's where you disclose a little. And this was Mark, my MO along the way. Well, I'm too embarrassed or ashamed or afraid or prideful or whatever to disclose everything. So I'm going to disclose a little bit. I'm going to disclose this. And then a month or 2 later, I'm going to disclose that. This particular thing I did, I'm taking that one to the grave, so we're not going to disclose that at all. And then we have this staggered disclosure along the way. And all we do with that, guys, is we just massive trauma blows to our spouse or partner, right? They think that they have everything, and then here comes another one, and here comes another one. And what happens is we send our partners into this hyper vigilant, clenching, tightening up their body, waiting for the next shoe to drop, waiting for the next big piece of information that I thought I had everything, but I don't. Please don't do it that way. It, like I say, it just takes trauma and magnifies it 100-fold. So no staggered disclosures. That's one thing.
Yeah, and there's a whole other discussion to be had about kind of the ongoing disclosure process, about how one is doing, relapses, that kind of thing. And we'll cover that another day. But what Mark is saying,
we're not talking about ongoing disclosures, in active recovery. We're talking about where everything's put out onto the table about past behaviors as an initial start to the recovery healing process. So Correct. This is the initial disclosure, the big disclosure at the front.
Yeah. And for sake of time, we're not even going to get into the purpose or recommendations behind it, other than one key one, because again, those are covered in those other podcasts Mark mentioned. But the big thing about this is that you need to have a therapist navigate this process with you.
Yes.
Somebody who's trained in formal disclosures. Certified sex addiction therapists or CSAT have that training. They're not the only ones that do, but you do need to have somebody who's familiar with that process in order to navigate that. Do not do this alone. Okay.
Yep.
But yeah, if just for sake of time, we'll jump right into kind of what this looks like. So let's just talk briefly about preparation for disclosure. So if you were wanting to, in other words, hopefully this podcast will be helpful for those of you who are considering a formal disclosure, and maybe this gives you kind of a leg up on what to expect and some ways to get ready. The first thing that needs to happen is that there does need to be, for the addict, there needs to be a lot of prep work done for disclosure. And usually that comes in the form of therapy sessions where a therapist helps an addict to lay out essentially their entire sexual history in most cases. And there's a whole dynamic for what to include in that, what parts of that may be such a thing as too much information. In other words, like unnecessary details and things. A qualified therapist can help walk you through that. But in addition to that, there are a couple of things that are really, really important with that. First of all, is working a good recovery plan. Formal disclosure. I guess we should start with this. Even though it's a really good process and when it's done right, it is helpful. But much like surgery, even when the purpose is intentional and the idea is to go in there and repair something, there is still a lot of damage that comes with it, because disclosures are never fun. They're always difficult. It's just a question of, is it a healthy difficult or an unhealthy difficult? Mm-hmm. And so in order to kind of inoculate against some of the issues with that, an addict has to be on point with at least one thing and as much as possible with the second. The first is he has to be in a place of having and utilizing tools consistently to be able to manage and mitigate shame. Disclosures will eat an addict alive. Even though all of us addicts were very well acquainted with our history in the past, there's something that happens in a disclosure that's difficult to quantify, where we drop all the walls around compartmentalizing and separating the different parts of our addiction, and we lay it all out vulnerably for our partner in one setting. It can be very overwhelming, very difficult. And so that part is absolutely critical, learning and having those tools in place to manage that, as well as a good support system. The other piece, if at all possible, is having a handle on sobriety as much as possible, because again, that helps with the shame, also helps to build trust with you and your partner leading into disclosure day, because again, it is a formal process that leads up to a point in time where we sit down formally and go through all of this in a therapeutic setting. So those are a couple of the prep work pieces on the side of a partner.
Mm-hmm. And just being prepared, right? What you said, Steve, is so important. When I sat down to try to put together my disclosure, and I basically did an entire sexual history timeline all the way back to when I was a little tiny kid, my very first sexual memory, and I worked my way forward. Incredibly triggering. I wasn't really prepared for how triggering it was going to be. Revisiting all of that, right? Putting it all out at once and following that whole timeline right up to today. You have got to be prepared. You got to have shame resilience tools in place. You've got to have a good support system in place. You have to realize that this is very much an example of how things can get, quote, worse before they get better, even though you're doing the right work. So you got to be prepared for all of this. Is heavy, heavy stuff.
Correct. No, absolutely. And that same work has to be done on the side of a partner as well. Again, skills and tools in place, not just to manage shame, but also trauma responses in real time.
Yes.
And there sometimes even needs to be some actual trauma work done before disclosure can happen. And again, a good therapist is somebody who can help you sit down and navigate not just how to do this, but the timing on it and what should be included and what should not be. Okay.
Yeah, just as the addict has to prepare to give disclosure, that the partner who's receiving that disclosure, he or she needs to be prepared for what's going to happen on their side, emotionally, psychologically, correct, physically, right? There's preparation on both the giver of the disclosure and the receiver of the disclosure.
Correct. And that actually is a good way to kind of get into the actual steps to this process, because contrary to popular belief, when a disclosure is done properly, in most cases, there are actually parts that not just the addict plays, but also the partner as well, in terms of getting ready for disclosure day. Sometimes we think of disclosure as just an addict preparing this humongous document around his history. He shares that, and that's kind of the experience, and then we move on. And that's actually not true.
No.
Disclosures are pretty interactive for both people. And so, like we talked about, the first thing is that the addict does have to get ready what's called the disclosure letter, which is that whole history that we just talked about. And that in of itself is a whole prolonged process. It usually takes at least a month, if not longer. And there's a lot to be said about navigating that with a therapist, but that's essentially what the disclosure letter looks like. Then the partner, however, does also create what's oftentimes referred to as an impact letter.
Yes.
When I do these letters in my office, I actually break these down into 4 main letters. I know a lot of therapists don't do this, but I find it to be helpful for a partner. I have them write 4 different letters that kind of constitute that overall impact letter. And they're letters of the following: a letter of sadness, a letter of anger, a letter of acceptance, and a letter of appreciation. And I find that, helping spouses to kind of group that helps them to navigate the wide range of emotions that comes up for a spouse in terms of trying to express the impact that this whole situation has had on them over the course of anywhere from months to years to decades. So, so that will be that's the other kind of component. And in that letter, again, there's with every element of communication in a therapeutic setting. While we don't allow things to become toxic, these letters are very real. They aren't held back because it's absolutely critical that a spouse, for a lot of different reasons, has an opportunity to find her voice that day and be able to voice those things. So that would be the next part.
Yep. And, something we didn't mention in the preparation process, it is so critical that both the addict and the spouse in betrayal trauma healing, not only having a therapist, but if you're both engaged in your own 12-step programs, enormously helpful. If you have a sponsor, somebody who's been down this road, it can help you with that. If you have a group of people that have experienced it and can support you, they can bounce stuff off of. All of that outside support system is super important.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So yeah, the support system piece is critical. Now, when it comes to actual disclosure, there are some things to do. But tell you what, before we get to the process itself and what that day looks like, the other piece that we ought to definitely talk about is the amends process. Because oftentimes the amends process will be mistakenly grouped in with disclosure. I have navigated some disclosures or been part of it in conjunction with other therapists where amends are sometimes navigated on the disclosure day, or at least begun. Sometimes I found that to be helpful. I would say more often than not, usually because the spouse is not aware of some information as part of disclosure day, or they aren't really aware of how they're going to feel, how that full disclosure is going to impact them. The amends process, where the addict sits down and comes up with a letter of remorse, as well as begins that process of trying to make a literal amends, take steps to do that with a partner and to try to undo some of the damage that they've done, it's usually more appropriate to keep that for a following session or sessions down the road. So just something to keep in mind.
And one of the reasons why the impact letter is so important is, as I work with guys, I know you do, Steve, the spouse's impact letter, or letters as you have them do, really becomes a roadmap for that addict in recovery's amends.
Yes.
Right. I want my guys to see all the ways that they've impacted a partner or spouse. And now as you start to put together an amends letter, reconciliation letter, yes, you're expressing genuine, regret and remorse and all of those things, very important. Also, you want to, if you want actual amends that matter, you've got to match up that regret and remorse with action. What does that
Yes.
action plan look like going forward? And that should be based on all of the ways that the spouse or partner has said it impacted them. Right? I see
Absolutely.
this impact. I'm so regretful of having caused all that. And now for that specific impact that you've mentioned, here's what I'm going to be doing going forward to give us the best chance of this being different as we move ahead. Very
Yeah.
important part of that amends.
Absolutely. And as we kind of wrap up here, something that's really important to do is to set up and walk through the process of, how to actually facilitate like the disclosure itself on disclosure day. Oftentimes with clients, we will, for example, have them drive separately. That's pretty common to
Yep.
disclosure. We also usually take a lot of time to set up having an alternate place to sleep for at least the addict. If they need a place to go. I actually just recently navigated a disclosure with a client who really took the process seriously. It was a partner that I was working with, and she actually found an Airbnb or something of that nature that was actually kind of at a retreat locale of sorts for a couple of days where she could just go afterwards. There'd been a long build up to that process. She knew it was going to be a really hard day. She'd actually arranged childcare as well, so that she and the husband could be free from kids for a few days and just be able to take time afterwards to process the day, because it is extensive and takes a long time and it takes a lot out of you. It's disclosure is one of those things where you can describe it to somebody and prepare someone for it, but until you actually do it, it's really hard to kind of quantify the experience and how it actually feels. So making sure that you have a plan in place, again, for childcare, sleeping arrangements, all that stuff to plan for, even if there aren't lots of triggers that come up for a partner and they end up feeling safe. I've found that over the years it's been wise to have partners and addicts separate for the night anyway, just to take time for themselves and kind of regather and regroup and then come back to it, when appropriate. So
Well, and as part of that after disclosure plan, being very, very real about the distinct possibility of what we might call a delayed rebound or a delayed reaction. Right, the feelings about that disclosure may not happen that day or the day after. It could be a week later, it could be a month later.
yeah,
Right? It
absolutely.
could be various reactions happening over time. There's no textbook with regard to how a betrayed spouse is going to respond, how long it's going to take, or what layers it's going to come in. You just have to be prepared for whatever those outcomes might be.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And there's again a lot more to this. We just wanted to today on our brief podcast, we wanted to give you guys just kind of a general outline of what to look for as you get ready for disclosure and what that should look like. It's a very involved and long process. There's a place where we talk about very long and involved processes and the nuances of that. If you're looking for a place to find and up your game in recovery, if you find that therapy is, at least at the rate that you're doing it, is too expensive. If you're looking for a place where you can get the vast majority of the benefits of individual therapy uh, rolled up into 25 hours of content, interactive engagement with therapists and a community of people, including support sessions with other addicts and spouses who are in this process in real time, just like yourself, for the cost of one or two therapy sessions, depending on where you live. May we not so humbly recommend that you check out our Dare to Connect program for addict spouses and couples, because we offer all of those things there. We'd love to interact with you on a more one-on-one level there and bring you all the resources and experience to bear that Mark and I have, and 20 years of, well, more like 40 years actually, depending on what you're
Combined, yeah.
categorizing. Yeah, combined personal and professional experience working in this field. Please don't navigate this thing alone. There's nothing out there like Dare to Connect. Grab your free trial on that if you have not already at daretoconnectnow.com. We'd love to have you guys join us and find out what everything's about there. As always, thank you so much for being with us and participating in the podcast. If you'd ever like something answered very briefly on the podcast, because they are inherently short, we'd always love to have you send us information or questions at or at pbscpodcast.com at the contact form at the bottom. We'd love to address those too.
Sounds great, everybody. Thanks for being here with us, and we'll see you on our next PBSC episode.
Have a great day, guys.
Everything expressed on the PBSC podcast are the opinions of the hosts and the participants and is for informational and educational purposes only. This podcast should not be considered mental health therapy or as a substitute thereof. It is strongly recommended that you seek out the clinical guidance of an individual qualified mental health professional. If you're experiencing thoughts of suicide, self-harm, or a desire to harm others, please dial 911 or go to your nearest emergency room.